in case. So we are starting. This is session number 6 of The Doctor Is In, and it's great to see you guys. I think most of you have tuned in before, which is great. So as you guys are already doing, keeping your video off and your audio muted, and then when it comes time for the question part, then I'll have you unmute yourself and ask questions, of course. If you want to show your face, that's great. If not, that's fine too. And the chat box is always open for your questions. We have a good discussion sometimes, even over the questions or some comments. So today I'm following up on my last webinar on strength-based interviewing with a focus on informed consent. And so although it doesn't sound like an exciting topic, it's actually one of the most important components of trauma-informed interviewing. So I'll back up and lay some foundational groundwork about why this is so important. Many of us probably think of informed consent as the form and the paper you sign before a medical procedure or when you're allowing access to your data. Most of us don't think much about it, but probably we ought to more than we do. But informed consent to a survivor is not only foundational, it can be empowering. So the basic needs of a trauma survivor are safety, acceptance, and control. And so if you think about it, these are everyone's basic needs, although it doesn't register to us on a conscious level. But a lot of what we do through a trauma-informed lens addresses these 3 things. And so the whole process of informed consent, when done properly, adequately meets these needs on several levels. So the simple act of asking permission addresses 1, safety, by acknowledging that some of the questions may be difficult to answer, and the interviewee can be prepared and take their time to answer. 2, acceptance. By including them in the process, it affords them dignity, and we are accepting their active participation in the interview. And 3, control. By allowing the interviewee to ask their own questions, to request a break, or refuse to answer a question without shame and penalty, gives them a feeling like, yeah, this is about me and I have control over the situation. And so asking permission can be empowering. I mean, how often, or when was the last time they've been asked permission for something to be done to them? Even before we get to the nitty-gritty of the information or stories, we are already establishing dignity and respect, which leads to empowerment and healing. So consent seems like a no-brainer. Of course we ask permission. We ask them to agree to participate in our programs or research project, to use their stories, even if anonymized, and to take their photos, even if we can't see their faces. But the key word is informed. Does this person know to what exactly they are agreeing? Do they understand the implications of refusal? Is the person terminating the interview because they're triggered or angry? Do they need a break? Or do they not understand and they're too embarrassed to bring it up? So consider HIV pre-test counseling. When I was doing clinical work in Thailand, we offered voluntary HIV testing with a process of informed consent with pre-test counseling. Nearly everyone agreed, but there were a few who didn't. With those that refused, and even some who actually did consent, I followed up on why. Sometimes they would say, I'm afraid of needles. So when I was able to show the tiny needle with which I pricked their finger, they were relieved. So I think in their mind, they probably thought I was going to take a foot-long needle and take half a liter of blood. Others had misconceptions about the test or the results and what it would mean for them. Most of them simply had a completely different idea about what the test entailed and how we would deal with the results. So I'm not entirely blaming the pre-test counselors because I think a lot of these cases would happen anyway, but I do discuss these potential pitfalls when training them. It's important to be very concrete when explaining and checking back in to make sure that they truly understand. Paying attention to informed consent. Ensuring that consent or rejection is truly informed is a way to avoid traumatization of the individual. Sometimes during a long interview, it may be helpful to check in with a person to make sure they're still okay with the questions. Misunderstanding and misinformation are correctable problems, and we might have to take some extra time to make sure that people get the care that they need. Social workers, case managers, nurses, or doctors, or others can sometimes forget the power dynamics at play. We breeze through consent. We assume that what is routine language and a routine process may not be so routine for someone who's been used and abused for a long time. This makes it even more important. It's sometimes easy for the beneficiary to simply agree to whatever is being proposed because the people doing the asking have some kind of perceived power over the survivor, whether they're providing some kind of benefit, and the survivor may not feel like he or she can refuse. On another note, there have been times in my experience when the beneficiary or patient was a bit confused by all these questions and assurances in the process, because it's not something that anyone cared or bothered with them before. And I've also seen instances where informed consent was not honored by the organization and the information was abused. So here's a story about how not to do informed consent. So in Thailand, there was a time I was helping a very ill, hospitalized African trafficked woman, and a nurse came in with an informed consent form for surgery, and she asked me to get the patient to sign it. The nurse told me I could do it because I'm a doctor who speaks English. But I didn't know what surgery they were going to do or why. I refused and told her that the doctor needed to return and explain the procedure to the patient. So the junior doctor returned, quite frustrated that I wouldn't do it. I lectured him on medical ethics, and I told him he was lousy and unethical and forced him to go through the consent. I even offered to translate, even though technically they needed to get an independent translator instead of doing the convenient thing, which is using the bedside caregiver. However, I knew that would be nearly impossible in that place, so I didn't press the issue. But the doctor was angry and rushed through the form, skipping many important points, on which I pressed him. I was making him do his job and take the time with a person that he didn't consider worth his time. So I'm really sorry this happened, but I'm glad I was the caregiver on duty at the time. So here's some components of informed consent, and I am going to share my screen here. Share now. So there's some basic components of informed consent. Introduce yourself and who you work for. Also, introduce the interpreter and anyone else in the room. You should explain the purpose of the interview and what will generally be covered. You need to emphasize that the interview is completely voluntary because we need to eliminate potential for coercion or any pressure that the beneficiary must participate because they're afraid that you won't help them or that they'll be shut out of the program or for whatever reason. So you need to state that refusal to answer any question or terminate the interview at any time is accepted. It should be pointed out that some of the questions may be upsetting or triggering. They can brace themselves. We can give them more time to answer. Confidentiality is very, very important. We need to ensure that what we will do with the information is kept secret, and we can let them know who actually has access to their information. And ask if the interviewee has any questions, or perhaps they have restrictions on the information that they give you. Can clarify understanding by having the interviewee repeat back some of the key points. We need to establish competency. Are they actually able to give consent for this interview or to participate in the research project? This is usually not an issue, but we don't want to interview someone who is under the influence of drugs or alcohol or has dissociated and is actually inhabiting one of their altars. That would not be proper consent. So it's also important, if we're serving children, we need to follow the governmental guidelines. What's the age of consent for this particular procedure? Are they emancipated? Do we need to check in with a parent or guardian? So I have a couple example statements of things you might say in the process of an interview. And so being grateful for the time and the information. Thank you for helping us help you. As much information as you can provide to the best of your knowledge. This was very helpful. We should ask them, what are you expecting out of this meeting or interview? What do you hope to get? Do you have any questions? You can ask me a question at any time. And sometimes you might stop and ask if they have questions directly because of the perceived power dynamic. They may not want to interject with a question, but you can offer them the opportunity in different times for them to ask questions. And it's important to say that there's no right or wrong answer, and that they can refuse to answer any question that they don't want to answer. They'll just move on to the next one. Of course, they can go back and answer a previously asked questions that they refused at any time. That's also fine. And also, if you're recording or if you're taking notes, make sure that they know how that information is going to be handled. And so just tell them what you're doing. I'm being very frank. I'm going to be taking notes. Is that okay? They're going into a confidential file. Just part of the informed consent is just being upfront and very concrete with what you're doing. So as to reduce any suspicion or anything that might cause a breach of trust. So informed consent also has a role beyond the initial interview. Although we're not always revisiting a formal informed consent in every encounter, it can be helpful to check in with the beneficiary at different times and in various meetings to make sure that he or she agrees and understands the plan of the day. This is a way to encourage participation, not only in the interview, but also sets the stage for participation in the whole caregiving journey. As I've said before, every encounter with somebody is an opportunity towards healing. So getting started in the right space helps lay a foundation of trust that will continue to be built throughout the clinician-patient beneficiary relationship. And specific to health professionals, it's important not to re-traumatize a patient during the history and physical exam. So we can do this by taking extra time to walk the patient through what you are going to do, especially during an exam. Explaining why and where you're going to touch them, being concrete as you can about your plan. For example, now I'm going to put my stethoscope on your chest. Would you mind lifting up your shirt? Or I'm going to slip it under your shirt, directly on your chest. Now I'm going to listen to your back. I'm sorry if the stethoscope is cold. And so this is especially important when examining parts of the body that the patient can't see, such as during a pelvic exam. And so you may have told the patient that you were going to do a pelvic, but then when it actually comes to doing it, they're like, oh, I see what you're doing now. And instead of waiting for them to freak out, then you might explain what you're going to do so that they can refuse, which is totally okay. So informed consent has some cultural and language considerations, and so it should be obtained in the individual's preferred language. Now, this is not necessarily their mother tongue. So someone may be more comfortable working in German or in English, for example, and their mother tongue is Swahili. It just depends. Just make sure that your language is easy to understand. I mean, you're not translating for a government official. It should be simple, simple, simple. And be prepared to have translated documents and a trained interpreter when necessary. Also consider how you'll handle a situation if an interviewee is illiterate. And more about interviews in a future webinar, but more about the translators in a future webinar, but ideally they should be trained in trauma-informed care. So it's really would be impossible to go through all the specific pearls or pitfalls or consider every culture or background. When you know your target group or likely demographic population, for example, Bulgarian or Romanian women in prostitution in Berlin, you can do some culture and language prep ahead of time. it's really important to do your homework. And so this also goes for working with people with LGBTQ background. Another thing to consider is that people who've been sexually exploited or work in street prostitution or brothels probably come from a different background than you do, unless you yourself are a survivor. So remember that body language makes up at least 70% of communication. And there can be very specific cultural necessary things to do, such as a proper greeting in their language, or doing a Y in Thailand instead of shaking their hand, as well as taboos like what not to do with your feet in Thailand. But sometimes body language is universal and common sense, like smiling. You can also take cues from the interviewee. When you see them backing off, you can slow down, or a puzzled look, or they're uncomfortable. That can be cultural, or it could just mean that they need to go to the bathroom and they're too embarrassed to let you know. So one of the things the last Q&A session, one of the participants, Jennifer, asked about why an African doctor in Africa caring for sexually exploited women in a clinic didn't seem to be sensitive or culturally attuned to the women. Why? I mean, there's layers of culture and expectations. The doctors there were behaving like that they thought was proper for a doctor, and had ideas about how patients need to accept the way the doctors are. Caucasian doctors in America who insensitively treat sexually exploited American women are guilty of the same thing. Same problem, different country. Location or similar culture doesn't assume cultural competence when dealing with a different demographic. So I've seen many of this since my medical training days. And like I said, culture can be different ethnicity, different country, different language. And that also goes for people of different sexual expressions as well. And so a lot of cultural bridges can be crossed with humility, compassion, common sense, and most importantly, love. Taking time, asking questions when you don't understand or want to learn. By asking them questions about how they would like to be greeted, offers another opportunity to offer safety and acceptance and control. So there's many aspects of interviewing and assessments to discuss, but of course I want to keep these short. I hope you go back and see the previous session about strengths-based assessment and return back here for more discussions in the future. So thanks for joining. I'd love to hear some feedback as well as suggestions for future webinars. Information on how to reach me is in the show notes below. See you back here soon. Recording is over, and soon time for your questions.